Elara Foster knew she'd made a mistake the second her blind date opened his mouth and started complaining about the temperature of his water. "Room temp. Are they trying to kill me?" The man, Travis, or maybe Trevor, snapped at the waiter, waving his hand like he was swatting flies. Elara offered the waiter a small, apologetic smile as he scurried off. Her date didn't notice. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and forced a polite laugh. "I'm sure he'll bring you ice." Trevor Travis leaned back in his chair, his voice booming. "I specifically said no lemon. If they screw that up, imagine what they'll do to my steak." Elara's eyes darted around the restaurant, desperate for a reason to leave. She'd given online dating a try after her best friend begged her to, but this was the third disaster in a row, and by far the loudest. That's when a deep voice behind her said, "Sorry I'm late, honey. Got caught in traffic." She turned, startled, and looked up into the eyes of a man she'd never seen before. He was tall, dressed in a navy suit that definitely wasn't off the rack, and his dark hair was slightly tousled like he'd just run a hand through it. His blue eyes flicked to Travis briefly before focusing entirely on her. She started, confused. He leaned down and kissed her cheek lightly. "You okay?" he whispered, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. Elara blinked twice, then nodded good, because in a second he turned to her date. "I'm going to need you to leave," the man said calmly, but with an unmistakable authority that made Travis freeze mid-sentence. "This is my girlfriend, and you're clearly upsetting her," Travis scoffed. "What? She said she was single, she was, until 5 minutes ago." The man slid into the booth beside Elara like he belonged there, his arm brushing against hers. "Now leave before I call the manager." "Or worse, yelp." The guy actually paled. He stood abruptly, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out. Lara exhaled, barely realizing she'd been holding her breath. She turned to the stranger. "Okay, what just happened?" He smiled for the first time, and it was unfairly charming. "You looked like you needed rescuing. I was sitting 2 tables over. Couldn't listen to that guy complain about water any longer." She blinked. "So you just jumped in?" "Yeah, sorry if that was out of line." Elara shook her head. "No, it was, thank you, seriously." "That was the worst date I've ever been on." "I believe you." He ordered bottled water like he was negotiating a peace treaty. She laughed, covering her mouth. "I'm Elara." "Atlas Fairbanks," he said, reaching out to shake her hand. Her eyebrows rose. "Atlas? My parents were big on mythology and drama," she smiled. "It suits you." A waiter returned and looked confused to see a different man sitting at the table. Atlas gestured at the menu. "We'll both have the chef's special and a bottle of the Shadhow Margox." Elara blinked. "That's expensive." "I know." He turned back to her. "Let me buy you dinner as a thank you for letting me crash your disaster." She hesitated. "You don't have to, I want to," he said simply. "Unless you have somewhere else to be." She didn't. And honestly, sitting across from him was already better than the last hour of her life. "All right," she said, "but I'm paying next time." His eyes twinkled. "So there's a next time," she flushed. "Well, I didn't say that." Yet, they talked through dinner like they'd known each other for years. Atlas was sharp, funny, and knew how to listen. He didn't talk about himself unless she asked, but when he did, she learned he ran a startup that had exploded over the last 3 years, something to do with logistics and AI. She didn't understand half of it, but the way his eyes lit up when he spoke. It was hard not to get caught up in his passion. By the time dessert arrived, she was laughing so hard she had tears in her eyes. "I swear," she said, gasping, "you did not walk out of a job interview just because the guy wore socks with sandals." Atlas grinned. "It was a tech startup. We have to draw the line somewhere." Elara shook her head. "You're ridiculous." He leaned forward, voice softer now. "You're beautiful." She froze, not because it was the first time someone had said that, but because it was the first time in a long time it felt like they actually meant it. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you always like this with strangers?" He hesitated. "No, actually I'm not. I don't usually rescue women from dates or crash their tables." "Then why tonight?" He looked at her for a long moment. Because the second I saw you, I didn't want you looking at anyone else. She swallowed hard. When they walked out of the restaurant, the valet pulled up in front of them with a sleek black Aston Martin. Elara blinked. "That's yours?" Atlas nodded casually. "Want a ride home?" She stared at the car, then back at him. "You're a millionaire, aren't you?" He raised a brow. "What gave it away, the wine or the car?" She laughed. "Both." He opened the passenger door for her. "Still want to pretend there's no next time?" She slid into the seat. "I'm starting to think you might be trouble." He leaned down, smiling. "Only the good kind." As they drove off into the city lights, Elara had no idea where this was going, but for the first time in years, she actually wanted to find out. Elara pressed her hand against the cool window as the Aston Martin glided through the city's quiet streets. The soft purr of the engine filled the silence between them, but it was a comfortable kind, not the kind that demanded to be filled. Streetlights painted golden streaks across Atlas's face, and she caught herself stealing glances more often than she'd admit. He noticed. "Something on your mind?" She looked down at her lap, then back at him. "You're not what I expected tonight." He gave a soft chuckle. "I'd hope not, though for the record, I didn't expect to be playing the part of fake boyfriend either." "You didn't hesitate," she said. "Not even for a second." He turned onto a quieter road, one lined with flowering trees and old iron lamp posts. "You looked like you needed an exit. I just offered one." She studied him. "You do that often, offer people exits?" He didn't answer immediately. "Not really. I usually keep to myself. Meetings, contracts, quiet nights. My assistant says I treat my calendar like a sacred text." "Sounds riveting." His lips curved. "It's safer, but tonight, I don't know, you looked like the kind of person who deserved better than what you were getting." Elara's chest tightened. "I didn't expect kindness from a stranger tonight either." He glanced at her, expression unreadable. "Maybe we're both off script." When they arrived outside her apartment building, he stepped out before she could unbuckle, circled the car, and opened her door like he'd done it 100 times. She stepped out, surprised by how reluctant she was to end the night. The early spring air had cooled, and the scent of blooming lilacs drifted from the nearby garden beds. Her building was old, with ivy crawling up the brick and a rusted gate that never quite latched right. She paused at the bottom step. "You want to come up?" she asked, then quickly added, "Not like that. I just have leftover lemon tart that really shouldn't go to waste." He looked amused. "Lemon tart rescue, huh? I suppose it's only fair. I did save you from a man who thought sparkling water was a threat." She unlocked the gate, letting it swing open behind them. Her apartment was on the second floor, and she felt suddenly self-conscious as she led him up the creaky staircase. The place wasn't big, just 2 rooms and a galley kitchen, but it was hers. Cozy, cluttered, full of mismatched furniture she'd picked out piece by piece. "Sorry, it's not." She trailed off. He stepped inside, eyes taking in the space. "It's warm," he said simply. "Most places I go feel like showrooms. This feels lived in." She gave a half laugh, moving toward the fridge. "That's one way to say chaotic." He leaned against the counter as she plated the tart. "I like chaotic. It means there's a story." "Plenty of those here," she said, handing him a fork. "Most of them involve broken appliances and passive-aggressive neighbors." He took a bite and raised an eyebrow. "I'm going to need this recipe." "You can't afford it," she teased, then winced. "That came out weird." "I didn't mean it's fine," he cut in, still chewing. "I like that you say what you think. It's refreshing." She leaned against the opposite counter. "So, what's your story then? You said you keep to yourself, but you don't seem like someone who's afraid of people." He paused, fork poised mid-air. "I'm not afraid of people. I just don't trust easily." She waited, sensing there was more. He set the fork down. "My father built his company from the ground up. By the time he was 50, he'd made his first 100 million, but he lost everything gambling on a merger that never happened. It ruined him. And my mother left before I could remember her face." The air shifted. "That's why I don't bet on people easily," he said. "Or let them in." She was quiet for a beat. "But you let me in tonight." He met her eyes. "I did." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. She walked to the small window by the bookshelf and looked out toward the city skyline. It's strange. I was ready to go home tonight and delete every dating app on my phone, just call it quits. Why didn't you? She turned to him. You, his gaze didn't waver. I wasn't planning to be anywhere near that restaurant. I was supposed to be in London tonight. Something told me to postpone. She tilted her head. You listen to gut feelings, only when they're loud. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight and something shifted between them, less flirtation, more awareness. She walked him to the door, her fingers brushing the worn wood of the frame. I don't usually invite strangers into my home, she said quietly. I don't usually get invited, he replied. She hesitated. Thank you for tonight, for showing up when I didn't know I needed someone to. Atlas looked down at her, his voice rougher now. You're not going to be just a story to me, Elara. She opened her mouth, but her breath caught. He stepped back, hands in his pockets. I'll see you soon. As he disappeared down the stairs, something unfamiliar bloomed in her chest. It wasn't just intrigue, it wasn't even just attraction. It was the dizzying pull of something real, something she hadn't felt in a long time. And as she closed the door behind her, her heart whispered what her mind was still too afraid to say. He wasn't supposed to mean anything, but he already did. Elara stared at the gallery invitation in her hand, trying to decide if it was a dream or a dare. One embossed card, delivered in a navy envelope with no return address, had been tucked into the mail slot of her apartment that morning. Inside were just 2 lines. Tonight, 8 o'clock. Where whatever makes you feel unstoppable. Atlas. She turned it over again, like the back might contain the real message, some hidden note explaining how someone could go from a casual dinner to orchestrating secret rendezvous like it was a scene from a film. She tossed it onto her coffee table and eyed the clock. 7:15. She told herself she didn't care, that it wasn't a date, that she wouldn't read into how her stomach had been in knots all day. But the truth was, she tried on 4 different outfits before finally settling on a navy jumpsuit that cinched at the waist and made her feel like she could walk into any room and own it. The gallery, tucked between a tailor shop and a perfumery in Chelsea, looked closed from the outside. The windows were dark, blinds drawn, no sign of activity. But when she stepped forward, the door clicked open on its own. Inside, soft amber light spilled from overhead fixtures, illuminating a long corridor lined with art. Elara stepped in slowly, her heels muffled by the plush carpet, the quiet hum of music drifting from deeper within. A woman with a sleek ponytail and a Bluetooth earpiece appeared from behind a sliding door. You must be Elara, she said without blinking. Mr. Fairbanks is expecting you. Elara followed her through a narrow hallway until they entered a circular room, glass ceiling above revealing the dark navy sky. A table had been set in the center, surrounded by towering white orchids and flickering candles. The entire gallery had been emptied for this moment. Atlas stood at the far end, wearing a charcoal vest over a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the line of his forearms. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her like she'd stepped out of a thought he hadn't dared finish. You made it, he said at last. I almost didn't, she replied, heart thudding. I wasn't sure if this was a trap or an audition, he grinned. You passed either way. She stepped toward the table, eyes skimming the paintings placed around the room, each one abstract, full of movement and fire and color. You bought out a gallery for dinner, I own it, he said simply. But I don't open it for just anyone. So this is the exclusive treatment? For someone who made me cancel a London flight, yes, she turned to face him. Why? He moved closer. Because I've spent too many years around people who want something from me. You're the first person in a long time who didn't ask for anything. She crossed her arms. You don't even know me. I disagree, he said. I know how you look when you're trying not to laugh. I know you keep your keys in that back pocket of your bag because you're always rushing. I know you don't like when people talk over waiters, and I know you don't realize how rare that kind of presence is. Elara felt her breath catch, but she didn't let it show. You're observant. I'm interested, he corrected. She sat, unsure whether to be flattered or unnerved. Do you do this often? Sweep women into private art galleries and tell them they're rare. He poured her a glass of wine. No, I'm usually in meetings until midnight, but I haven't stopped thinking about you since the restaurant. She sipped slowly, trying to steady herself. You don't even know what I do. You're a grant writer, he said. You work for a nonprofit that helps improve literacy programs in public schools. You take the subway even though you hate crowds, and you keep a notebook in your purse with quotes you collect. Her jaw dropped slightly. How? I asked my assistant to find out, he said unapologetically. Not because I wanted to know everything, but because I wanted to know if you were real. Elara set her glass down, unsure how to respond. He leaned forward. I don't trust easily. But I trust how I felt when I looked at you across that table, and I think that matters. She met his gaze, her voice quiet. I'm not part of your world. I don't want someone from my world, he said. I want someone who sees through it. The food arrived on silent carts, brought in by staff who disappeared before she could thank them. Every dish was plated like a painting, each one more surprising than the last, a dance of flavor and color and texture. She'd never eaten like this before, and Atlas watched her reactions like he was memorizing them. Later, as they stood beneath the glass ceiling, the stars faint behind the city haze, he turned to her with a question that landed like thunder in her chest. I'm flying to Lisbon tomorrow for 2 nights, he said. Come with me, she blinked. What? No pressure, no expectations, just you and me. I'll show you a world you've never seen, and if you hate it, you can fly back before dinner. She stepped back, needing air. This is crazy. It's honest, he said, and I won't ask again. She stared at him, heart racing. Why me? Because, he said, stepping closer, you make me want to stop running. She didn't say yes, not yet, but she also didn't say no. And that, for Atlas Fairbanks, was more than he'd expected. Elara stood at the edge of the marble terrace, warm Lisbon air brushing over her skin like a secret. The city stretched below, rooftops stacked like crooked teeth, glowing under the golden hour sun. It was quieter here, above the din of traffic and tourists, in a penthouse so high the clouds looked like visitors. Behind her, the doors to the suite had been left open, white linen curtains fluttering like breath. She could hear the faint sound of a cello playing from the built-in speakers, something rich and slow and aching. She hadn't made her decision until the wheels left the tarmac in New York. One moment she was standing in her apartment, suitcase still zipped. The next she was in Atlas's jet, barefooted and wide-eyed, with a glass of something citrusy in her hand and a man across from her who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. Now, 2 days later, she wasn't wondering if she'd made a mistake. She was wondering how she'd go back to before. You always get this quiet before dinner? Atlas's voice was low behind her, close enough that she could feel it vibrate down her back. Only when I'm trying to figure something out, she said, not turning yet. He stepped beside her, his jacket draped over one shoulder, the top buttons of his shirt undone. His watch glinted in the light as he leaned against the railing. Want me to guess what it is? You'll be wrong. I can live with that, she glanced at him. I don't know how to be this version of myself. The one who wears silk and eats on rooftops in Portugal. You don't have to be anything but who you are. That sounds like something easy to say when your life is built on sky lounges and private chefs. He didn't bristle. Fair. I work with budgets that can barely cover toner cartridges. You tip more on a meal than I make in a week. You think I don't see that? He asked, voice calm. How much more impressive it is that you still show up every day and fight for something that doesn't benefit you personally. That kind of integrity doesn't get enough credit. Elara blinked at him. I know I come from a world that looks shiny from the outside, he went on, but most of the people in it are running from something. Ego, legacy, pressure. You walk straight into things even when they're hard. I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm constantly behind. He reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. Then stay next to me. Let me help you catch up. She didn't pull away, she didn't know how to anymore. That night they ate under strings of lanterns on a private terrace overlooking the water. Between courses, Atlas told her stories about the places he'd visited as a child, when his father was still trying to build a future they could both be proud of. Elara listened, asking things no one else had about regrets, about the difference between ambition and obsession, about what it meant to lose and still keep standing. "You know," he said, swirling the wine in his glass, "there's something no one tells you about getting everything you ever wanted." She tilted her head. "What? You realize you were chasing the wrong things." She set her fork down. "What are the right things?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Conversations that stay with you, quiet mornings, someone who makes you feel human when the world keeps trying to make you a brand." She reached for his hand again, this time without hesitation. By morning, they were back in New York, and Elara expected the spell to break. But it didn't. Instead, Atlas began showing up at her office with coffees and questions about her day. He listened to her pitch ideas about donor outreach with genuine interest. When her supervisor mentioned a funding crisis, Atlas asked for the details not with his checkbook, but with a notepad, jotting down ideas for how to restructure the campaign to attract corporate sponsors. "I don't want to fix your life," he said one evening at her door. "I just want to be in it." She let him in without a word. It wasn't perfect. There were nights when she struggled with how easily he moved through the world, how doors opened before him without effort. And there were moments when he grew quiet, retreating into himself when things didn't go according to plan. But they learned to navigate the spaces between them. He taught her how to fly without apologizing. She taught him how to land without fear. Then came the gala. She hadn't planned to go. She didn't own anything remotely appropriate, and the idea of being paraded in front of New York's elite made her stomach twist. But Atlas insisted, not because he wanted to show her off, but because he wanted her by his side when he finally announced he was stepping down as CEO to start a foundation focused on funding grassroots education programs. When he stepped onto the stage in his tailored black tuxedo, the room held its breath. "My father once told me that power only means something when you use it to lift others," he said into the mic. "For a long time I forgot that. But someone reminded me." He glanced at Elara, standing off to the side in a midnight blue gown he'd insisted she keep after a fitting that made her want to cry. "She reminded me what it means to build something that lasts, not profits, not prestige. But people." The applause echoed through the space, but Elara couldn't hear it, not over the thundering in her own chest. Afterward, he found her near the balcony, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "You did that," he said. "You made me want to be better." She touched his lapel. "You were already better, you just forgot." He held her gaze. "I love you." She didn't wait. "I love you too." He pulled her into his arms, and the city disappeared. Weeks later, they stood on a quiet rooftop in Brooklyn, surrounded by string lights and their closest friends. There was no orchestra, no press, no designer spectacle. Just a vow exchanged in whispers, promises made not in grandeur but in truth. Atlas didn't need another empire. He'd already found his everything. The first time Elara stepped into the new foundation's headquarters, she stopped just past the threshold and simply stared. It wasn't the vaulted ceilings or the floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with sunlight. It wasn't even the custom art installation made entirely of books donated by children across the city. It was the unmistakable feeling that something she'd once only dreamed about had been made real, and it had her fingerprints all over it. Atlas came up behind her, rolling up his sleeves as he always did when he was about to dive into something. "It's not perfect yet," he said without preamble, "but I figured we'd start here." She turned to him, her voice quiet. "You remembered the reading nook." He gestured toward the corner where oversized pillows and soft rugs surrounded a low shelf of picture books. "You said every child deserves a space that invites them in, not intimidates them. You listened." "I always do." They spent the rest of the morning reviewing staff proposals, meeting with program directors, and walking through the development plans for their first international partnership. Elara had never seen Atlas like this collaborative, grounded, entirely focused on something outside himself. He didn't command the room with ego, he invited people in with clarity. Watching him work like this made her fall for him all over again, in a quieter, deeper way. At lunch, they ate on the rooftop garden that overlooked the city skyline. It had been her idea to plant native wildflowers along the edges so the bees don't forget they have a place, she'd said half-jokingly, and now they bloomed in bursts of yellow and violet across the terrace. Atlas poured them both iced tea, the ice clinking lightly in the glass. "I signed the final paperwork this morning," he said. Elara raised an eyebrow. "For what? My apartment on 5th. I'm selling it." She blinked. "You love that place." "I loved what it represented. Now it just feels like a museum exhibit. I want something we build together." Her breath caught. "We," he nodded. "I've had architects draft up a plan, not a penthouse, a home. One with a real kitchen and a messy garage and a backyard too small for a tennis court but perfect for bad barbecues." She laughed. "You don't even know how to grill." "I'll learn, or I'll ruin dinner and order takeout. Either way, I want that life." "With you?" Elara looked out over the skyline, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. "I used to think I had to choose between purpose and love, that having one meant sacrificing the other." Atlas leaned forward. "You don't." "Not anymore." That evening, they returned to her apartment, the same one she'd lived in before all of this began. She hadn't given it up, not because she needed it, but because it reminded her who she was before the whirlwind. It grounded her. And on that night, it became the setting for one last surprise. When she walked in, there was no music playing. No candles, no elaborate dinner, just a small wooden box resting on the coffee table. Atlas took it in his hands as she approached, then opened the lid. Inside was a ring, simple, beautiful, and designed with a tiny sapphire tucked beneath the diamond. A secret only the wearer would know, like her. Quietly brilliant, he didn't kneel, he didn't need to. "Elara Foster," he said, voice steady, "the life I had before you was successful. But it wasn't whole. You are the missing piece I never knew I needed. I want a future where we keep building foundations, stories, a family, whatever we dare to dream. Will you marry me?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she breathed, the word full of certainty. He slipped the ring on her finger, and she pulled him close, her lips finding his in a kiss that tasted like forever. They were married 6 months later in a sun-drenched garden surrounded by the people who mattered most. The ceremony was small by Atlas's standards but perfect by hers. There were no fireworks, no drones filming overhead, just the crackling sound of laughter, the scent of lilac in bloom, and the kind of joy that didn't need to be announced to be felt. After the vows, Atlas surprised her with a small brass plaque unveiled in the new children's wing of the foundation. It read, "In honor of Elara Foster, whose belief in stories changed mine." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. He took her hand, and they stood there in the quiet, surrounded by shelves of books and the hum of a future just beginning. Years passed, not in a blur, but in distinct, vivid chapters. They built a home on a quiet street just outside the city, where Atlas learned badly how to grill, and Elara planted a garden with flowers that never quite grew straight. They adopted a dog that chewed on every shoe but slept curled between them like a guardian of dreams. They traveled, but not for status, for stories. They visited the first library funded by the foundation in Morocco, watched a reading circle in a school in the Philippines, cried together when a child in Detroit wrote a letter thanking them for making books feel like friends. Elara never stopped working, not because she had to, but because purpose was in her bones. And Atlas never tried to change that. He simply stood beside her, holding doors open not because she couldn't, but because he wanted to walk through them together. One autumn evening, long after the foundation had expanded across continents, and their home was filled with photographs and laughter and soft, worn furniture, Elara sat beside Atlas on the porch, her head against his shoulder. "You ever miss the old life?" she asked. He looked out over the yard where wind chimes danced softly in the breeze. "Not even for a second," she smiled. "Me neither." And as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting everything in a warm, golden hush, they sat hand in hand, hearts full, their story complete, built not on wealth or fate, but on the quiet, steady magic of a love that chose to stay.